there is a softer side of you waiting to emerge from the shadows. You are not rough, you are merely weighted down by the understanding that you have that heartache and struggle belong to you, when indeed they were not assigned to you. You were conditioned to believe in things like overachieving as a model for success. There came a time when the pain of the weight of the mentality that you were fed became too much for you to bear, and so, looking at yourself more closely, you began to ask yourself the vital questions regarding if the reality that you had been living was yours or if it belonged all along to someone else. You walked a long journey until your feet began to bleed. You wrapped them up with bandages, and still, the blood spilled forth from them. You kept walking for what seemed like 1,000 days and 1,000 nights. Sometimes you would lay down your swords, hoping someone who could actually see you and be kind to you would appear. But then, when you dared to open your heart and share the burden of the journey on which you had walked, they would draw the sword of their own pain, and you realized that it was a good thing that you still had that shield. Just ahead, you saw a light shining on the path in front of you, and what looked surely to be the place of refuge that you had been seeking all along. So as much as you were hurting and crying from the wounds the one you dared to let in left, you looked inward, and you grew a new kind of understanding that you never had before. You recognized, however, that now you had bloody feet and a bruised heart, yet something in you had grown more fearless. And so you stood up and continued on your journey, and you told yourself, I will not give up. Just up ahead was a giant pit, and you saw it, but somehow you still fell in. At first you felt great anguish, but then you decided to sit in that dark place and take a rest. As you were resting, you began reflecting on the journey that you had been on thus far, and for some unknown reason, you kept staring up at the moon. As you began to feel refreshed and found the darkness start to feel safe, you then realized that even though the whole thing seemed like it was hopeless, there was a branch growing on the side of the pit. Funny how you never saw it before, but there it was, right in front of you with the moonlight shining upon it, as though it was a beacon of hope, telling you to climb out of this place you had now found safety within. You contemplated for a little while how it might be easier just to stay there in that pit, as you were reminded that outside of it there were many reminders of the suffering that you had already endured. One last time you closed your eyes and you looked within your heart, and suddenly you had the will to live. So, you grabbed onto the branches of the vine and you began pulling your own self out. When you got out, though, you decided, this time I will be very careful and I will certainly be able to see any pitfalls that may lay ahead. You were much wiser now and you were less afraid. Besides, what else could you face that you could not get through now that you had literally gotten yourself into a hole and climbed your way out of it? You kept walking down the path, and in a little while, a person came and started walking right beside you. This person looked very familiar to you, but you remembered what happened the last time that you put those swords down. So you kept only one in your hand, and you put the other one away. No words were spoken at first, though you kept looking over at each other, and yet you journeyed side by side for what seemed like a very long time. After a while, you thought to yourself, maybe I should find out what this person needs from me. And so you started to speak, and suddenly a great lightning bolt came from the sky and the earth split apart. You could not find your new companion. It seemed as though the earth had literally opened and swallowed your new friend whole. You began to think a lot about how comforting it was to walk alongside that one, and you wondered if your newfound friend would ever come back to you. As you walked, day by day, the journey began to get easier. The sun was shining on you, and the winds would come to cool you. You would even find great comfort in the peace you felt inside of you when it would rain. You used to be afraid of thunderstorms, But now, you noticed that the lightning came with an energy that you learned how to use. Many moons would pass over you and many more hurdles would come, and yet you no longer saw them as creating suffering in your life. Instead, you would come to understand that each time you walked with faith through what would have used to trouble you for a long time, it became easier to accept everything without judgment. You even began to have compassion for those who would try to hurt you, as you remembered all the things that you never used to understand. You just kept walking and shining light out from your soul, as you had begun to find happiness in the smallest of things. You took time every day to sit down and be still. And one day, after doing this, and when you were miles down the road, you realized that you had left your swords. You thought for a moment about going back to retrieve them, but suddenly you realized how light the journey was now that you weren't carrying them around. You eventually made it to a town and you saw people there. Hesitant at first, you proceeded to walk down the streets of the town. You forgot what people used to be like on the journey when you first started. So you began to slowly smile at some of them, still not speaking your truth to anyone. However, whenever they would smile back at you, you felt very warm inside of your heart. You were about to get back on your journey and you looked at your shield and you realized how much it had been weighing you down and making the trip take so much longer. So you left it there, lying on the ground, and you walked on down the path feeling much more free than you ever had before. As you continued walking, you noticed a place a little ways ahead, and it looked to be a forest full of something shining. You were now intrigued, and so you kept walking. Yet you walked much more quickly now that you were no longer carrying your swords and your shield. Strangely enough, you also no longer felt afraid, and you noticed that as you walked, you were starting to hum a melody. As you got closer and closer to the shining forest, you grew more and more sure that you were now walking on the right path. Each day as the sun shined down on you, you could feel yourself becoming more radiant and filled with light. The love that you felt inside of you seemed to lift you and made the journey go very, very quickly now. You finally came to the edge of the forest, and you asked yourself one question before you stepped in. Do I trust myself and believe in myself enough to do this? Suddenly you heard a voice calling out to you, and so you decided that no matter what, you had to see where that voice was coming from. As you walked along the path underneath the tall and looming trees, you felt a little of that old fearfulness that you had trying to creep in on you. But each time that happened, you remembered just how far you had come, just how much you had learned to believe in yourself, and just how much you were starting to truly love yourself. As you continued to walk along the path, you started to notice fractured pieces of what looked like a broken mirror laying there on the forest floor. Suddenly, you heard a voice calling out to you, and so you decided that no matter what, you had to see where that voice was coming from. As you walked along the path, underneath the tall and looming trees, you felt a little of that old fearfulness that you had trying to creep in on you. But each time that happened, you remembered just how far you had come, just how much you had learned to believe in yourself, and just how much you were starting to truly love yourself. About halfway through the forest, it suddenly occurred to you that maybe these pieces were meant to be put back together. So each day as you continued to sit in silence, you started to put the pieces back into place. As you were walking, you realized that the voice was still calling out to you, and it was growing in intensity. This voice was the sweetest sound that you had ever heard. So you kept walking and putting those pieces back into place. One day, when you were wondering how much longer this journey might take, you came to the edge of the forest, and there was a grove of old trees, sturdy and strong and 100 feet towering in the sky. The voice was coming from those lovely trees, and you noticed that there was a lot of shade with a little sunlight shining through. So you decided to sit down and take a well-earned rest. You were sitting in stillness again, listening to the sound of your own heart beating and taking in deep breaths. You reflected that perhaps this would be a very good time to put the rest of the pieces into place. You began your work sheltered by these guardians of the forest. As you came to the end of putting the pieces together, you realized that they had come together to make a beautiful mirror. Holding the mirror up, you looked into it. You realized that you were suddenly seeing the person who had been walking next to you so long ago. The one you never said a word to and who had disappeared from your sight. You couldn't believe what you were now seeing. You cautiously and with great love stared at your reflection as you made your way up to look deeply into your own eyes. The voice you had been hearing as you walked along the path through the forest suddenly sang out loudly, "I was waiting for you."